The cold was a living thing. It crept into Cale Riven's veins like venom, slow and paralyzing, coiling tighter with every breath. Frost laced his eyebrows and clung to his lashes. Each exhale fogged the cracked visor of his flight helmet before vanishing into the dim, ice-shrouded wreckage of the scout ship. He was dying. That much was clear. The emergency beacon pulsed faintly somewhere behind his head, too weak to breach Morellifor's magnetic storms. The rest of the crew hadn't survived the crash. Cale had checked, crawled through twisted metal and torn plating with dislocated ribs just to be sure. Now, with the last of the reactor heat bleeding away and the planet's long night pressing in, there was nothing left but silence and the slow grind of ice creeping up the hull. His fingers, wrapped in a thermal liner slick with dried blood, reached toward the hollow recorder nestled beside the console. A final message, maybe. Not that it mattered. The storms would eat the signal just like they'd swallowed the distress call. Still, it felt like the kind of thing someone should do before freezing to death on a hostile moon. If this finds anyone, this is Lieutenant Cale Riven of the United Terran Vanguard, Recon Unit 7. My ship's down, coordinates logged, though I doubt they're worth much now. Reactors gone. Oxygen's fading. I've got maybe, he paused, blinking at the HUD's flickering display. An hour. Maybe less. Tell command they built one hell of a scout. He laughed, a dry rasp that hurt his throat. Then he coughed, a sharp spasm that bent him sideways and nearly blacked him out. Pain brought him back. Pain and the soft, persistent memory of her voice. Stay put. I'm coming for you, Cale. He'd heard it just before the feed died. Mara Voss, commander of the SS Vindicator. Cold as Neptune's shadow, sharp as a vibroblade, and more terrifying than any alien fleet he'd ever faced. She didn't say things she didn't mean. But hours had passed. Hell, maybe days. Time blurred when your blood started to slow. Cale leaned his head back against the buckled bulkhead. The stars outside had vanished behind the storm. The dim interior lights flickered, then steadied at half power, casting long, soft shadows over the jagged wreckage. He should have died on impact. He didn't. That felt unfair, somehow. Like fate had missed its cue and left him dangling in the final act. A hiss of wind pushed through a crack in the outer plating. The temperature dropped another degree. He tightened his grip on the photo in his palm, the edges curled and singed at one corner. Mara, laughing in a rare moment of light, helmet under one arm, hair wind-whipped. Taken by Cale during a recon prep on Dareth 6, just before the war got ugly. He'd teased her for smiling. She'd threatened to throw him out the airlock. She'd never smiled for anyone else. A sharp groan rippled through the ship's frame. Ice shifting. The surface of Morellifor wasn't solid. It was a layered hellscape of glacial flows and subterranean pressure chambers. A wrong creak, an entire wreck might plunge into a crevasse deep enough to swallow sunlight. Part of Cale hoped it would. Quick beat slow. He'd seen the slow before. Friends who lingered too long. Frostbite taking fingers, then limbs, then memory. He tried not to think about how warm her voice had sounded, even over static. He tried not to imagine the fury in her eyes when command ordered her to stand down. He tried not to think of her breaking those orders. Because she wouldn't. Not for him. Not after what happened on Arion. Not after the choices they'd both made. Or maybe she would. Maybe she'd already launched, and the storm had taken her too. Maybe this whole frozen moon was just a graveyard of good intentions. His breath slowed. Cold was numbing the pain now, turning it into something distant, almost peaceful. His heartbeat echoed in his ears like a fading drum. He stared at the ceiling, at the jagged edges of metal bent outward from the crash. They looked like the ribs of a great beast, cracked open to reveal the hollow ruin inside. Cale's eyelids drooped. There was a sound then. A low, distant rumble. He frowned. That wasn't the wind. The wind whined and howled. This was deeper, like thunder, but steady mechanical. It grew louder, more distinct. The walls vibrated. He sat up too fast. Pain screamed through his chest, but he forced himself to stay conscious. Lights flickered. Something was shaking the ice beneath the wreck. Then it hit him. Not thunder. Not weather. Engines. Boring engines. His breath caught. For the first time in hours, the air didn't feel so thin. The vibration intensified, shaking loose frost from the ceiling. Metal shrieked under pressure. From somewhere below, a sharp impact cracked through the structure like a hammer to glass. Cale dragged himself toward the nearest port, wiped frost from the lens. Just before it cracked from the pressure, he saw it. A glow beneath the ice.
Bright.
Orange.
Alive.
He smiled, lips split and bleeding, voice just a whisper. Mara, then the wall exploded. Mara Voss ignored the protests from the command deck as she shoved past the trembling flight officer and dropped into the pilot's chair. She didn't wait for clearance. The codes were already keyed in, the override protocols already breached. If the Admiral wanted to drag her over the coals later, he could. But not until she had Kale back. The Vindicator's engines roared to life, vibrating through the bulkheads like the pulse of a leviathan shaking off sleep. Around her, the deck lights flared red. Unauthorized launch. Violation of command chain. Potential dereliction of duty. Shut it down. Someone yelled behind her. Commander Voss, you are in breach of. She cut the comms with a flick of her wrist. The cockpit silenced. The only sound was the thrum of the fusion drive and the whisper of her own breath. Her gloved fingers clenched the controls like they were lifelines. Morella 4 coordinates locked. The AI confirmed. Voice neutral. Trajectory plotted. Entry path is highly unstable. I'm aware. Survivability rate is. Don't care. The stars twisted around the canopy as the Vindicator surged from orbit, cutting through the stratosphere like a knife. Below, the ice moon seethed with churning cloud bands and electric storms that lashed the surface with violet arcs. Morella 4 wasn't just hostile. It was infamous. More ships had vanished in its atmosphere than in all the other moons of the system combined. It was the kind of place the brass told stories about to scare green recruits. But Mara wasn't green. She'd fought through plasma storms and asteroid fields. She'd survived ambushes by void wraiths and stared down mass drivers. The only thing that had ever truly shaken her was the thought of leaving Kale Riven behind. And now she was headed straight into hell for him. You're insane, her XO had said. He's gone. Even if he's not, no one survives down there for more than a few hours. Then he has a few hours, she'd replied. And I intend to make every one of them count. The Vindicator shuddered as it pierced the storm ceiling. Outside, visibility dropped to 0. Turbulence hit hard and fast, buffeting the ship with fists of wind and shards of ice. Mara locked the harness across her chest and engaged manual steering. Auto and AV couldn't handle this kind of chaos. Lightning streaked across the bow, casting jagged shadows inside the cockpit. The sensors screamed warnings. Systems failed and rebooted in staccato bursts. She flew blind, relying on instinct and the faint distress ping they'd caught 2 hours ago before the storms overwhelmed it. Just long enough to know he was alive. Just long enough to know she had to act. The display flickered. A beacon pulse, faint but steady, bloomed on the screen. Coordinates locked. A surge of adrenaline jolted through her. Prep the drop pod, she ordered. I'm going down. Commander, the AI warned, the pod was not designed for subterranean penetration. Stress tolerances. Prep. The pod. The ship obeyed. A whir of clamps releasing, servos charging. In the bay below, the experimental bore pod, intended for geological drilling, not rescue missions, spun up its internal drives. 1 seat, 0 weapons, barely armored. But it had one thing she needed: raw digging power. Mara stood in the cargo bay as the floor split open to reveal the pod, lights casting sharp white beams against its narrow hull. She pulled on the exosuit with practiced ease, sealing it tight, locking the neural interface into the control harness. Kale's face burned in her mind. The way he'd smiled when everyone else was afraid. The way he made jokes when he should have been panicking. The way he'd covered her with his own body on Arion Station when the reactor went critical. Stupid. Brave. Infuriatingly human. He'd saved her life once. This wasn't repayment. This was justice. She stepped into the pod. The canopy hissed shut around her. Initiate launch. Trajectory locked. Descent will exceed safety limits, the AI warned. Good. The bay opened to blackness. Then the pod dropped like a bullet through the storm. Mara's teeth rattled. The pressure screamed against the hull. The ice tore at her with razor claws, sheets of it slamming the sides as the borehead ignited, spinning, melting and slicing through the subterranean crust. She was plunging through solid frozen rock at suicidal speed. Alarms wailed. Structural integrity, danced on the edge of red. But she held the controls steady, guiding by feel, heart thundering in her chest. The beacon grew louder in her headset. Closer. Stronger. Then impact. A shudder so violent it almost knocked her unconscious. The pod had struck something, metallic, jagged, half buried in the ice. The wreck. She forced the emergency release. The canopy blew open with a burst of steam and light. Mara scrambled out, boots crunching on the fractured ice of the cavern created by the crash. And there he was. Cale, slumped inside the shattered cockpit of the scout ship, eyes barely open, face white with frost. The atmosphere hissed as it bled through cracks in his suit. She crossed the gap in seconds, ripping the emergency oxygen from her pack and slamming it onto his chest harness. His body convulsed once, twice, then his eyes flickered open. He stared at her, dazed. "You're real," he rasped.
She didn't speak.
Just cupped his face, checking vitals, verifying stability. He was cold. Dangerously so. But alive. Finally, she let out a breath. "I told you," she said, voice low and raw. "I was coming." Cale tried to laugh. It came out as a wheeze. "Took your sweet time?" She smiled, but only for a second. The ice above groaned again. Loud this time. The boarpod's descent had destabilized the cavern. Cracks spiderwebbed overhead. She looked up. Her window was closing. "We're not safe yet," she said. And then the ceiling began to fall. The ceiling gave a low, groaning warning, then fractured with a sound like the sky itself tearing. Ice splintered in jagged sheets, cascading from the cavern's apex in a frozen avalanche. Mara didn't hesitate. She threw herself over Cale's barely conscious form and activated her suit's kinetic shield. It flickered to life just as the first slab hit. The energy barrier flared white, shuddering under the impact. Cracks spiderwebbed along the ice above them, but the barrier held, barely. Cale coughed, wheezing against the oxygen mask. "Tell me you have a plan." "I did," she grunted, glancing back at the half-buried boarpod. "It involved a less dramatic exit." "What now?" "We improvise." The kinetic shield wouldn't last long. The emitter was already whining, its charge bleeding out. She had minutes, maybe less, before the whole chamber collapsed and swallowed them whole. She scanned the wreckage with rapid eyes, searching for anything usable. The ship was mangled beyond repair. The reactor core was dark, the NAV system slagged. But the aft thrusters, Cale had mentioned they were semi-intact before blackout. If they still had power. She grabbed Cale under the arms. He winced but didn't fight her as she half-lifted, half-dragged him toward the pod. His legs weren't cooperating. The cold had settled in too deep. Frostbite, maybe nerve damage. She couldn't worry about that now. One thing at a time. Get clear. Get to the surface. Get him warm. The boarpod groaned under their weight as she crammed them both inside. It wasn't designed for two, but there was just enough space if she didn't mind sitting with Cale half in her lap. He gave a weak, lopsided grin. "Romantic," he muttered. "If we don't die screaming in a tunnel." "Still might. Wouldn't be the worst date we've had." She sealed the hatch. Ice pelted the pod exterior like hail as more debris fell outside. Mara initiated the power cycle, bypassing the damaged return protocol and rerouting auxiliary thrust to vertical ascent. The pod wasn't built for this, it was meant to go down, not up, but with the borehead reversed and the forward stabilizers angled, she could make it punch through the ceiling like a missile. Or try.
"Hang on," she said.
"I can barely feel my toes. I'm not going anywhere." The pod roared to life, the walls vibrating with strain. A high-pitched whine filled the cabin. The retrofitted borehead spun in reverse, its heating coils flaring molten orange. The pod lurched, then shot upward into the collapsing shaft like a cannonball. Mara braced herself, shielding Cale with her body. The ride was worse than descent. Turbulence slammed into them from all sides, ice cracking and fusing in a chaotic blur. Sensors failed. Warning lights strobed red. A frozen boulder clipped the side of the pod, sending them spinning. She corrected with a jerky thrust of the port stabilizer. The cabin tilted, shook, screamed. Then light. Not daylight, but brightness. The kind of glow that meant atmosphere. The top of the storm layer. The outer ice crust. The pod burst through the surface in a gout of steam and fire, arcing into the air like a flare. It didn't fly far. Gravity dragged it back down almost instantly, slamming it into a snowdrift with bone-jarring force. Silence followed. Mara blinked. They were alive. The hatch popped with a hiss. Cold wind blasted in, clean and sharp, but less bitter than the subterranean cold. A broken sky stretched above them, gray with turbulence, but fractured with strips of clear sky. She looked down at Cale. His eyes were open, focused. His color was marginally better. "I told you," she said, voice shaking. "I wasn't leaving you behind." He studied her face for a moment. "You look awful." "I just tunneled through a frozen moon with a glorified drill bit."
Still.
"Terrible." She laughed once, too exhausted to care. Her muscles ached. Her suit was running on fumes. But she'd done it. Against orders, against odds, she'd pulled him from the jaws of the void. Above them, something rumbled. She looked up sharply. Not ice. Not wind. Engines. A shadow passed over them. The Vindicator, maneuvering low and slow, searchlights sweeping the surface. Her crew had overridden the locks. They'd come for her anyway. A calm signal buzzed in her ear. "Commander Voss, we have visual. We are descending for pickup." She tapped the transmitter. "Bring med-evac. Lieutenant Rivens in critical." Acknowledged. The shuttle's landing gear crunched into the snow beside them. A ramp descended. Medics in thermal suits raced out with stretchers and heaters. Cale was lifted away, IVs already snaking into his arm. One medic gave Mara a sideways glance, uncertain. "You okay, Commander?" She nodded. "Just tired." As they carried Cale inside, his hand reached back toward her. She caught it, held it a second longer than regulation would allow. He didn't need to speak. She already knew. As the ramp sealed behind them, and the warmth of the shuttle wrapped around her like a blanket, Mara Voss let herself finally exhale. She hadn't saved him because she was supposed to. She'd saved him because no one else would. Because beneath the armor, the orders, and the cold calculus of command, some things were worth breaking for. Cale Riven was one of them. And hell would freeze twice before she ever let him go again.